Welcome to the Austin Center for Spiritual Living. This is a recording of a talk presented on the morning of April 15, 2007 by Reverend Dr. Richard M. Prussia. The title of the talk is, How Do You Think About Yourself?
This sermon this morning is kind of interesting in that each time I began to work with ideas, I kept changing my mind and starting over. And so I'm not quite sure what I'm really talking about today. I have notes. I mean, you can be assured of that. I'll say something, only because I have to open my mouth and it just keeps coming. You know how we preachers are. But the title of what we're dealing with this morning, of this sermon, is, How Do You Think About Yourself? And it's a really interesting question, and I came to realize as I was going through, putting together my ideas here, that kept changing, that I really have to ask that question of myself. And the more I looked at it, the more I realized, for this morning, maybe I ought to go back and take a little look at what the basis is of what we teach. Because what we teach has an awful lot to do with this whole idea of what we think about ourselves, what we see ourselves to be. So I thought I'd take a look at some things. First of all, the name of this church, this center, is the Austin Center for Spiritual Living. You'll see it on your bulletin, on the front of the bulletin, and just below that there's kind of like a slogan or a statement of what we're about. Austin Center for Spiritual Living, teaching science of mind and spirit. What do we mean by that? Well, there are three very significant words in that statement, and one of them is science, another one is mind, another one is spirit. So doing things the way I generally do, I look them up in the dictionary, and I've looked them up numerous times over the last 30 years that I've been a minister. And let me give you some of the definitions. I pared them down a little bit to suit my purposes. You know how you do with dictionaries. A science is a body of knowledge or a systematic accumulation of knowledge, leading to the development and understanding of general laws. That makes sense, doesn't it? We call ourselves a science. Is that what we're about? Are we a systematic inquiry into the way things work, what the relationship of things are, based on fundamental principles? And I say, yeah, I think that's true. Mind, now this is when you really get into it, because there's all kinds of definitions for mind. They talk about the subconscious mind, the conscious mind. They talk about the superconscious mind, talk about the ego mind, and they talk about all kinds of mind interactions and all of that. Well, there's a pretty simple definition that comes out of the dictionary that I kind of like. It says, the mind is that which thinks, feels, wills, exercises judgment, perception, and reflection. It is the philosophical and general term for the center of mental activity, the center of creativity in humankind. And I like that. That pretty well covers it for me. We can get off into a lot of metaphysical interpretations and spiritual interpretations, but this is the way we tend to use the word mind every day in our lives. And then spirit. Again, another one of those words that in the dictionary it has a list so long, all these different definitions and connotations. But what I got, the first couple of ideas that came out of it, the non-physical part of a person regarded as the true self, capable of surviving physical death or separation. The soul. So I think we can relate to that. Now I looked at this and I mixed it all up and I said, now what do I say the science of mind and spirit is? And after massaging this quite a while and looking at it, this is what I wrote. This is my definition. Therefore, it has to be right. Of the science of mind and spirit is this. It is the knowledge of and the inquiry into the nature of spirituality and creativity within all things. Now, I could have made it a little differently. It's, the knowledge of and inquiry into, or whatever, the nature of the way the universe works, what my relationship is with life, God, yours, mine, so on. That's, I think, implicit in this definition. I stood back and I looked at that. Now, that's pretty good, the knowledge of and the inquiry into the nature and spirituality, of spirituality and creativity within all things. Is that any different than what you'd find in almost any church? And I thought about it and I said, no. The churches I'm familiar with and that I've gone to all would embrace pretty much that idea not argue with it. They'd add a bunch of stuff, peripheral to that. But that's pretty close to what most people would believe. And then it dawned on me, there's got to be some distinction. So what distinguishes us, what we teach in this thing called the science of mind and spirit, from others? Let me go back to the basics. And it really starts with the first few verses in the Gospel of John, which tells us that God is infinite. God is without limit. In the beginning was the Word, the creative intention, which was God, expressing itself, imposing or not imposing, but this impulse, that's what it is, to express itself. God is infinite. Because God is infinite, there was no other things made except that was made through the expression of it. That's John 1:3, pretty much. Therefore, I must be part of it. You must be part of it. Everything is part of this one thing. That's a pretty mind-blowing idea. We've talked about it over and over and over. Our mind is part of the God mind. Our intelligence is part of the God intelligence. Our balance and harmony is part of the balance and harmony. Well, these are the nature things, the basic characteristics of the infinite. Our creativity is part of the God creativity. We begin to lump all these things together. Therefore, we can say that the things that we think, the things that we say, the things that we feel are going to determine our experiences of life. So, how do you think about yourself? That's the big question. That's a question I think should recur over and over in the days ahead of us here. You see, we set into motion new causes that are going to deliver to us what we believe. And this is what we're talking about in this whole business of the science of mind and spirit. This is what we talk, meaning when we're talking about the law of mind, the law of cause and effect, the law of mind action, the law of manifestation. It's all the same law. The law of attraction, which is very popular these days. It's all the same thing. It is the law, and there is only one law, and many different connotations on this. But it is the basis by which everything works in the universe. It's totally impersonal. It responds to us according to our intention within it. This is the basis of this aspect of the science of mind and spirit. That's more about the mind than it is about the spirit. The spirit goes on into more mystical things. But we're talking right now about the law as related to the science of mind. This is background to the teaching of the science of mind. Now, what distinguishes us from other teachings that could totally embrace that idea of, any church being an inquiry into the nature of spirituality and the creativity of all things? What really distinguishes us is a very simple thing. And it doesn't have necessarily to do with the basic beliefs about truth, but it has to do more with the emphasis that you find in other disciplines. Not all. I mean, some of my minister friends in the mainline standard brand churches think very much the same way that I do about things, that we do about things. But the real distinction, I think, is that we openly declare our godness, our divinity, our image and likeness of that which created it all. We openly declare that. And some people find that a little difficult to do because they want to keep a separation between themselves and God way out there somewhere, and they're never really able to reconcile themselves to it. And yet their whole task in life is to continue trying to unify with God. We recognize that we are already one with God. Now that's basic teaching in all religions, but most churches have created a structure that infuses it with the concept of separation. God is there, I am here. God is great, I am not. And in this teaching, in the teachings of Jesus, of Buddha, of Lao Tzu, of Krishna, they all acknowledge the godness of us. To define yourself in terms of human limitation is a desecration of the image of God you are. I've used that before. It's a quotation from Paramahansa Yogananda, a Hindu. Hindu yogi. And it's so true. The minute we begin to attach ourselves to the limitations that we perceive in life and we perceive within ourselves, is what we've done. What we've done is we've desecrated the image and likeness concept in our own minds. We said, no, it isn't that way. We say it in church. We pray that way and we talk that way. But we say, no, it's really not that way for me. And yet, as we begin to understand this, and then we begin to understand that there is this law, this principle that we can use, that we can apply in our lives in order to bring about changes in the manifestations that we see all around us, we realize that every day we're seeing manifestations of this thing that we call the law of attraction, the law of mind, the law of manifestation, or whatever you want to call it. It's the same thing. And we believe in that law, don't we? Well, kind of. You believe in that basic ideas that I've been talking about here. Otherwise, you wouldn't be here this morning. There are other people who really don't believe this. They want to maintain their separation, their sense of separation. They're comfortable with that. Or they are hesitant to take on the full responsibility of functioning as a God child in this domain, in this realm within which we live. But most of you here, I dare say, really believe this at some level. But do you believe it for yourself? Or do you just believe it for others? And I say that because I know I've heard people say things, Lord knows I've said it myself, way long in the past. Now I'm enlightened, of course, and I don't say those things anymore. But I've said things like, I just can't do that. That is just not me. Now, I'm not going to say that there aren't things that that are pretty unlikely that I'll be able to do. Like at my particular age, I'm not going to go out and be able to run the 4-minute mile. And when I think back over my experience, I'm not sure that I ever could run the 4-minute mile. I'm not sure that I was given the kind of physical equipment that would allow that. What I'm really saying is that we are here to tap in to the maximum potentiality that we are, and that is virtually unlimited. And yet, we tend not to believe it. That person over there can do it, but I'm not sure I can. And I believe that because I've seen them do it over and over and over. But me, I'm pretty good at relationships, or I'm pretty good at taking care of my body, or whatever. But, the financial affairs of my life have always been a mess. I'm not sure that I can really do that. I told myself for years something that's interesting. Say, I've always had money come into my life. No problem with money. There have been times of really tight, when you're a young engineer just out of engineering school and you got 4 kids and your salary is not real high. You're counting your pennies and all. But money always came to me. There were some tight times. And then it got better and better. But I had a little phrase that ran through my mind over and over, and that was, money always comes to me. I just can't hold on to it. It was about 10 years, maybe 15 years ago, when I realized what I was saying to myself. I had already been a holy man at that time for about 15 years. I've been doing this stuff for 30. I thought, what am I saying? What am I setting into concrete? At the deeper levels of my mind that I've accepted it as so. And when you do that, when you have that kind of a belief, when you have that kind of a pattern, what you do is you attract. It's the law of attraction. It's the law of cause and effect. You attract to you everything that is necessary for you to support the continual desecration of the image and likeness of God that you are. Okay? It just happens that way. So I began immediately to redirect my thoughts that money always comes to me, there is always plenty, and some of it sticks. And with the rest, I have a good time in life. Okay, we can reformulate the way we think about things, the way we think about ourselves, and instead of saying, some areas I'm just not good at, remember what Solomon said in the Proverbs. As a man thinketh in his heart, or a woman, as you think in your heart, so you are. So shall you be. How do you think about yourself? Well, you know, there are certain areas where there's more and more evidence that is coming up every day. And the more evidence we have for the viability of these ideas that we propound and bounce around all over the place, the more we are apt to believe in them. And one of the areas is in the area of healing, mental healing. More and more medical scientists and other health professionals and other health professional arenas are coming into the realization that there's this real connection. None of us denies that. We hear about it all the time. I was going through my files the other day and I came across an article that was written quite a long time ago by a doctor in Montreal. And this is a guy named Robert W. Shepard, Dr. Robert W. Shepard. He's an MD resident psychiatrist at Douglas Hospital, or was. I don't know if he's even still alive. And he wrote this article, and the article was entitled this. You say, well, there are things much more modern than this, because this is quite a number of years ago. But it's pretty good. I like the way he said things. He says, you're being constantly conditioned to think sick. Well, you know, all the health professionals are there to help us get healed. He says you're being constantly conditioned to think sick. And then this is what he says. He says, by constantly warning people to be on the lookout for such things as, I never heard of this, but this has it in capitals, the 7 deadly signs of cancer. We're conditioning people to think sick. And when you think sick, you get sick. The process of thinking sick seems more common in North America than elsewhere and may well represent a major health threat or threat to the health of our nation. Now think about it a little bit. What happens every fall when we know that there's going to be a lot of flu popping up? Everybody got to run out and get their flu shots, or maybe a little later in the fall. May not that be a certain kind of conditioning, one that is propounded or perpetrated by some of the pharmaceutical companies, or am I being doing too crass to bring that up? And then in the spring, you know, everything begins to bloom and the winds begins to blow, and we've got the pollens flying all over the place, and we get the reports every evening on mold and ash and cedar and all of that on the weather report or in part of the weather report and all. And get out there and get your allergy shots or pick up. I wonder how much those sorts of things predispose us to experiencing that. I don't know. I can't prove it, but it's beginning to look more and more like these are things we have to take control of and be responsible for in our life and not allow somebody else to dictate to us what we must do in order to ensure good health. This guy, Shepard, he goes on and he talks about another doctor. These are just little excerpts. And this is a guy named Dr. George Engel, a researcher in psychosomatic medicine from Rochester, New York. Described the link between expectation of illness and the development of illness, both mental and physical. He found that people who resist illness, who don't anticipate it, remain appreciably healthier than those who expect or give into illness. That's kind of interesting, isn't it? Oh, there's a little sentence that I missed. I skipped over here. He said, we now have medical evidence to prove that people who worry about themselves and their health are more prone to sickness than those who ignore their health and get on with the business of living. Wow. Should we just ignore our health? I don't know quite how to interpret that. I think we're responsible for paying attention and monitoring and looking at things and getting checkups and all of that. But then, let it go and get on with life. And this is something we have to concern ourselves with as we get a little bit older. You know, I had an uncle. He died. He was in his 90s when he died. He was a very active, vigorous guy, going to Clear Lake in Northern California, teaching kids how to water ski when he was in his 80s. Can you imagine? But the last few years of his life, I'd visit him whenever I'd get to San Francisco, and I'd go home for a visit. And I'd go in, and all we ever talked about was his doctor appointments and the latest diagnosis and how he was feeling and all of that. And I thought, I will never, never, never do that. What do I find myself doing? How are you, Richard? Oh, let me tell you. I have to keep reminding myself, I'm not concerned with that. I want to take care of myself, but I want to get on with living. There are a lot of things like that. I have several things written down here, but I'd run out of time. I'm going to run out of time anyway. But there's one in particular that's really useful. It illustrates a point. And some of you may have heard of this experiment because it's been done many times. And there were some medical professionals who got together and they heard about this one technique for hypnosis and so on. Anyway, they got a guy under hypnosis. He was in a trance, and they suggested to him, or told him, that this rod, it might have been a pencil, I don't know, the tip of it was a red hot metal tip, and they were going to touch him with that, and it would burn him. It was at room temperature, and they touched him, and a blister immediately developed. And it was a burn. It had all the, what do you call it, morphology, physiology, all the characteristics of a real burn, and it had to heal in basically the same way. This is incredible when you think of the enormous power that you have available to you through your own mental processes and the way you think about yourself. How do you think about yourself? Now, this is a wonderful power that enables you to use this law of manifestation for your benefit. And the law will work for you or work against you. It doesn't care because it's totally impersonal. It'll only produce according to what the concept is in your mind, which is part of the God mind, which is part of the law. I have a friend. I have more than one friend, actually. This is a guy that I haven't seen in over 30 years. But I'd hear from him once in a while, and I just got a call from him the other day, a few months ago. I worked with him. He was a scientist on the staff at Los Alamos when I was up there at Los Alamos, and I had my laboratory, and then there was an open space. This was in the basement. They had laboratories all over the place, and a little basement, open space, and his laboratory was, about 50, 60 feet over. And we got to know each other pretty well. This was a guy who's an example of one of these who believes one way in one arena of his life and another way in another arena of his life. He was absolutely brilliant. You ever seen the television program Numbers? Some of you have seen that, this mathematical genius that's on it. Well, that's like my friend. He could do things with numbers you can't imagine, manipulate them. When he wrote in equations. We used to look at it and say, he handed back to him and say, Homer, I can't read Chinese, you know. It was that complicated looking. And he'd do some wonderful things. That's one arena. Professionally, he was great. On the other hand, with automobiles, he was a loser. Whether he bought a new car or a used car, if it was used, it would be a junk. You would never tell it by looking at it, but it would be a junker. If he bought a new one, it was a lemon. And most of us there in Los Alamos, it was kind of a closed community. There's about 15,000 people. There's 7,000 employees or so. And we dealt with the same dealers and stores and agencies around town and in the valley. And we'd go to the same places. We'd buy used cars. They're good cars. We'd buy a new car. No lemon. But I saw this happen. He and I were working partners, kind of, for about 14 years. I was there longer than that, but for about 14 years we had laboratories more or less adjacent to each other. And I just saw him do this over and over and over with his cars. Yet, on the other hand, then you have to ask, what does he think about himself? How is he thinking about himself in relationship to automobiles? Is he attracting that? I tend to think so. You can make up your own mind. In another area with Homer, was athletics. I never seen a guy like him. When he was in his 40s, he decided to take up skiing. And we had our own, the city of Los Alamos had its own private ski area. It was open to the public. They just paid more to get in. It was a nice and a challenging ski area. Well, he took up skiing in his 40s, and within 2 years, he was a fully certified Rocky Mountain ski instructor. Not an easy thing to do, folks. He became my instructor, and the last time I skied was, I guess I was 64 years old, but maybe a little later than that, before I came here. And I still couldn't ski anywhere near the way that guy could ski. And he accomplished that, and he left it, went off to do something else. He got into karate. And in a record time, he became a super duper black belt. I don't know, they have different degrees of this. And whenever the Korean master would come in to visit from Korea and tour the country, and they get to Los Alamos or northern New Mexico, he was one of the students that he would show off. He would show Homer off to everybody else and what he could do. And I can still remember during his lunch hour and during coffee breaks, he would be down in that space between where I had my office and laboratory and when he had his offices and laboratory. There was this space, and he had mats pinned up against the wall and mats on the floor. He'd be kicking the wall and going through all of these antics and making strange noises. He was an incredible athlete. An area that he really thought about himself in a very favorable way. Another area, he griped, moaned, bitched, and complained about people. He didn't like people, politics, politicians, institutions. On and on and on he'd go. I'd get tired of listening to this guy. And he used to say an interesting thing. He'd say, I just don't see any good in that guy. I don't see any good in those politics. I don't see any good in people in general. I don't see any good in the institutions of this. And he'd go on and on and on. But it was always, I don't see. Before I left there, he was diagnosed with one of the worst set of cataracts, and he was going blind. I don't see. Is there a connection? I don't know, but it's worth looking at, isn't it? It's worth thinking about. Every area of our lives, every area is affected by how we see ourselves, how we think about ourselves. How do you think about yourself? Do you think of yourself as being a bright, creative, healthy, intelligent, wealthy, loving, compassionate, balanced person? Or do you think about yourself in terms of limitations? So you ask the question, how do we develop this powerful, positive belief about ourselves? Now here's the trick. It's very complicated. We develop that by getting results in our life. How do we get results? What do we talk about here all the time? Spiritual practices. You replace the negative, and I'm going to leave you with a few things this morning here, which are the keys to getting results in your life. You replace the negative, limiting thoughts with positive affirmations. How many times have we talked about that here? Hundreds. We learn to pray affirmatively. There's a little card that's over on the information table called Effective Affirmative Prayer, Basics, and on this side, Stages. It gives you really what you need to get started and go on and expand and become expert at it. You don't need any more than this card. But you need to, and this is the third point, practice, 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 practice. Immerse yourself, which is the fourth point. Immerse yourself in the environment, the mental environment, the physical environment. Associate with people like you. And practice, encourage practicing. And you go on and on and on with this. I have a friend of mine, Michael's son. Some of you may know Michael's son. He's gone back to his original name, Michael Davis now. Michael and Paulette's son, they did the on-course processes. Well, never mind. For a long time. And Michael used to have I think it was one of those martial arts things that he did. He was very much into it, a very spiritual practice. And he was frustrated because he'd been doing it for years. And he went to his master and he said, "Oh, master, how long do I have to practice before I am a master?" And the master looked at him and he said, "Michael, you have to practice until you realize that all there is practice." Isn't that an interesting statement? All there is practice. And that's the way it is with these things. You have to use these spiritual practices over and over and over, and you never stop. Another thing, focus on what you want. Pray for what you want. Know what it is you want. How many times do you pray for what you want to get rid of? And all you're doing when you pray for what you want to get rid of, what you don't want, is you're opening yourself for more of that to come in, because that's where you're focusing your attention. Another thing, very, very important. A lot of people will sit back and they say, well, I can get in a good mental space and blah, blah, blah. And they go on all this euphemistic stuff. And they say, but I just don't know how that could ever possibly happen. No. It's not your job to know how. That's God's job. It's only your job to get very clear on your intention. And then leave the rest to God. And finally, the final point, don't give up too soon. Have you ever started a process and gotten a particular point and finally given up, and then later wondered, I wonder what would have happened if I'd kept it up just a little longer, or if I would have done this just one more time, or if I would have contacted one more person? Now, there does come a time when we can give up, but usually that comes as a result of your contemplating, immersing yourself in it, thinking about this, working on it, and then you wake up one day and realize, that's not really what I was looking for. So that's wonderful, because you've opened up a creative process within you that allows you to see more clearly. But I can never forget what I think one of the most famous speeches that was ever given, or given during the 20th century at least. It was during the height of the bombing, the Blitz in Britain. It was in the darkest days of Britain in the Second World War. And Winston Churchill stood before his people and he gave his 5-word speech. He looked at them and he raised his hand and he spread 2 fingers on his hand in the shape of a V for victory. And he said, never, never, never give up. Let's have a little prayer, shall we? There is a power and a presence in the universe, and that power and presence is part of what each one of us is. There is but one life, that life is God. There is but one power, that power is God. There is but one mind, that mind is God. There is but one love, and that love is God. One creativity, one intelligence.